Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Spirit of Prophecy podcast. I'm excited to have a new guest on the program today. We have Dr. Alan Kurschner, and if you are not familiar with him, he's done a lot of stuff over the years on the subject of the Pre Wrath Rapture. I've seen some of his debates in the past. I've seen a lot of videos he has done debunking the pre-trib, and one of the reasons I know about him is I've had people, when I've been discussing the pre-wrath position, often his name would come up. And so several years ago, I looked him up and seen some of his stuff and enjoyed it. I've watched some of his stuff, just kind of talking about historical positions that people have held to. And that's a subject that I am far from an expert in, but I do think it's an interesting conversation piece. And so anytime I've listened to videos that he has done on the subject of eschatology, I've always gotten a lot out of it, and I thought it would be fun to have him on the program and just to kind of get some of his perspective on these things. And so, Dr. Kurschner, if you want to just tell everyone a little bit about yourself and your ministry.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on this program. I think it's always a good thing to have a platform to two Christians. We can get together and interact and talk about biblical prophecy and eschatology, where a lot of people want to ignore it, which I don't think is a good thing, because we're told that we're going to be blessed if we understand these events. Not just being blessed, but some of the most severe warnings from our Lord have to do with understanding these events. So my ministry is Eschatology Ministries, and it's devoted to heralding the gospel of Christ in this dark world, not just his first coming, but the good news of his second coming as well. And so I come from what's called a premillennial, pre-wrath perspective, and I can get into that, explain that in the course of our show.
Okay. Yeah, so when it comes to your position on eschatology, have you, I'm from the pre-trib, premillennial world, and used to be very dispensational. Have you always kind of had this position, or did you at one time hold to a pre-trib position or anything like that?
Yeah, I grew up pre-tribulational, and in southern Wisconsin, and it wasn't until a few years after high school I was introduced to the pre-wrath perspective, and I was just kind of really curious. But it was it wasn't in a vacuum. It was in a time in my life where I was just. It was my wandering years. I wasn't a believer. I grew up as a fake believer in a independent fundamental Baptist background. And when I say that, I don't say it derogatory. I have a lot of affinities with my independent fundamental Baptist brothers and sisters, and I love them. I just think they're in error on this particular issue. But it was. I had a vacuum in my life, and I was introduced to the pre-wrath perspective, and I was hit with the truth that, the last generation of the church is going to experience its worst persecution. And, when the Antichrist arrives, and I was taught all my life, or growing up, that is, that the Antichrist persecution was God's wrath. Well, I learned, no, that's not the case. The scripture makes it clear that these are two different events, that the church is not going to escape the persecution of the Antichrist, as they've never escaped any generation of the church, including the first generation. But we will escape. We won't experience blood-bought believers will not experience the wrath of God. We will escape that, the day of the Lord's wrath. So, but to make a long story short, God saved me through the doctrine of the second coming of Christ, because it kind of woke me up, not just the idea that the church is going to face the Antichrist, but where am I going? What am I ready? Am I, if I was to even, regardless of the Antichrist issue, if I were to die that day? And so it really, I came to the realization I'm going to hell. And so I repented, I gave my life to the Lord. And so this topic of the second coming of Christ is dear to my heart. And just over the years, I've pursued to study it more in depth, and I went on to further education, and today I have a a ministry proclaiming the grace of God and the good news, and trying to wake up the church to, don't ignore this topic to your peril, but to embrace it and understand that to be an overcomer, the message of the overcomer is not some nebulous cliche that we hear often, but it has very concrete ramifications for the church.
Yes, and it is true that most independent fundamental Baptists are wrong on this issue. I still consider myself an independent fundamental Baptist, but I'm also kind of an outsider because of my position on eschatology, and it is a very divisive topic in that world if you're not pre-trib. And so one thing that I wasn't sure about too when it came to your position, do you still consider yourself a dispensationalist in any way?
Good question. If we go back to Charles Ryrie's essentials of what he understands as dispensationalism, and it's basically three principles. Number one, the distinction between the church and Israel, the grammatical historical method of interpretation, and the third is that God does all things for his glory. Those are the three essentials. So interestingly, people who don't call themselves dispensationalists would actually agree with those three principles. The issue is the application of especially the first and the second. So the first principle, the distinction between the church and Israel, I would agree with that. I think the traditional dispensationalists who are typically pre-tribulationists, they take it to an unwarranted biblical extreme. They would say that the church in Israel are so distinct that God doesn't even work with them at the same time. And so I would completely disagree with that. In fact, my current book, Pre-Trib, Examining the Foundations of Pre-Tribulation Rapture Theology, the first half of that book is addressing that whole question that, no, God, yeah, there is a distinction between the church and Israel, but God works with both at the same time. He's worked with both at the same time in the past. He does right now. He's making Israel jealous with Gentiles, and he will in the future. And so in that sense, again, it just depends on how you understand dispensationalism with those principles. The second one, quickly, is the grammatical historical method. Well, okay, I would say that traditional dispensationalists, they may also affirm the grammatical historical method, which is their second essential principle, but they apply it wrongly. I think they actually come to these texts on the second coming and they apply it inconsistently because I feel like they force their pre-tribulational imminence theology into certain passages. I don't think they take they may affirm grammatical historical, but they don't apply it consistently. The third is interesting, though. The third principle of dispensationalism says that God does all things for his glory. And again, it's very difficult for anybody to disagree with that. But I think pre-tribulationists are inconsistent because what do they teach? They teach this secret coming of Christ. And I think, no, it's actually he's coming. That undermines my view. It diminishes the glory of Christ in his second coming. Rather, when Christ comes back, and he's coming back in all of his glory, the whole world is going to see him. His people are going to be delivered, and the whole world is going to understand that God's judgment is impending. So when we talk about the question of dispensationalism, again, it just depends on how one applies those principles. I'm not a dispensationalist in the sense of how they apply those principles. I'm not a traditional dispensationalist. I do affirm the important distinction between the church and Israel, but that certainly doesn't make me a traditional dispensationalist.
Yeah, I mean, because I obviously reject dispensationalism, but at the same time, it doesn't mean everything they say in the name of dispensationalism is false. And it does seem that your modern dispensationalists today, they're trying so hard to teach that pre-trib that they've made dispensationalism do and teach some crazy things that a lot of people wouldn't agree with. And even when it comes to the distinction between the church and Israel, There's some areas we would probably disagree on that, but there's a lot of nuance there that I think we need to have more conversations about that just aren't happening. And I feel like most dispensationalists, they use that distinction between the church and Israel as just a way to throw out, anything that clearly shows us being here for the tribulation, and then they just make it all about Israel. And I think that's a big mistake. And it seems to me that, from just conversations I've had, and then even books I've read, and I would say most of the books I've read are ones that have been written in the last 50 years. But it does seem like in the last before 50 years ago, there was a lot more variety on a lot of eschatological positions, where it seems like in the 70s, to me, that's when everybody kind of got locked into a real hardcore pre-trib position and all that. But I do want to, I would like to just hear some things from you that maybe you think would be helpful when it comes to historical positions, because people on our side often make the argument, a lot of your pre-tribulation stuff started in the 1800s, with dispensationalism, John Nelson Darby, all that kind of stuff. I've heard them pull phrases out of context from people to try to make it look like it's an older position. But I guess, what do you think people need to know when it comes to church history and eschatology? Because most of us are not well versed in that.
Sure. So there's a certain anachronism that pre-tribulationists use today. Quite often, when the early church fathers used the term, for example, tribulation, they weren't referring to, not necessarily, they were many times they referred to God. They were referring to God's wrath. They weren't referring to the Antichrist persecution. So we have to be careful, because what I'd like to do, I'd like to just cut to the chase with those who claim that there's pre-trib statements in the early church. I always ask one question: can you show me any passage, any early church father quote that states that the rapture of God's people, or the resurrection, rapture and or resurrection, occurs before the emergence of the Antichrist? I have never, ever had one single pre-trib exponent take me up on that. But like you mentioned, they typically the quotes are very selected. They're excerpt. The context, the larger context, is usually not there. But yeah, the early church, they believed that we would escape God's wrath, but they never taught that there would be a rapture or a resurrection occurring before the Antichrist persecution. In fact, in my book, Antichrist Before the Day of the Lord, I show that I have multiple early church fathers that explicitly state that the church is going to face the Antichrist persecution. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you mentioned that too, because that's one of the things I've noticed when I have read some of the early church writings and older writings, is the terminology that we use today seems to be a very, a lot of how we use words are how Clarence Larkin used those words. We have a typical, so for example, in the independent fundamental Baptist world, and amongst many, when you say tribulation, that means 7 years. That means everything on Clarence Larkin's chart, that is the tribulation. And I do think one thing that you have to do, and you can't do this just from reading one line, but you have to look at how those early church people were using these words. They had different definitions. They used those words differently than we do today. And so, yes, it is, Ephraim the Syrian, for example, when he taught, people like to refer to him, but if you read all of his writing, it's crystal clear he was not even close to a pre-trib position, but they take one line where he said something similar to what they say, but when you read the rest of his writing, he wasn't using those words the way we do. He was talking about escaping through the tribulation through death is what he was referring to.
Right. Right.
So
Yep.
I think that's interesting. So, what would you say historically were some of the more common positions that people held, not just like pre-trib, pre-wrath, post-trib, but even like premillennial, amillennial, stuff like that?
Well, I think that Augustine was the first newspaper Bible prophecy student. And what I mean by that is, before Augustine, I mean, the prevalent view was it was a premillennial viewpoint. The very early church, up to the first 250 years, affirmed the idea that the kingdom will be established when Jesus returns, not before he returns. And the context of amillennialism coming in, especially in the fourth century, early fourth century, was, well, you have Constantine, you had the newly Christian Holy Empire, and Augustine and other theologians were like, whoa, this is the emperor. He's a Christian now. What, so when they went to scripture, they read back, they thought the kingdom of God has been established on earth. So what they did with these future kingdom passages in the Old Testament and other places, they read their current events or newspaper exegesis, if you will, or eisegesis, if you will, back into what was going on and back into scripture. And so they and that's another reason why I believe that they spiritualized the promises to Israel. It's like, no, the church is now fulfilling the promises to Israel. The church is the new Israel, and the kingdom of God is being realized right now. So and I mean, we have statements from Augustine and others in the fourth century creating this new hermeneutic, even to the point where some of the theologians started talking about how premillennialism is now heresy. And so you had that for centuries, and of course that was carried on in the Reformed area, especially Calvin and Luther and others. They took that eschatology. Unfortunately, they didn't reform on their eschatology, and they took that, and so you find that Reformed tradition, amillennial tradition, carried on through the centuries. However, there were, I mean, for example, Puritans. There are a number of Puritans who also affirmed a future national Israel and premillennialism, and of course there are pockets of a resurgence, especially in the 19th century for futurism and premillennialism.
Yeah. Now, when you bring up too how a lot of them believed in like a future for Israel, like the Puritans and stuff, and I don't know, because it seems to me that a lot of the teaching about the restoration of Israel today, that they have applied it to, the Israel of 1948 and things like that. But do you think is there anything to indicate that the Israel that they were expecting to return was going to be from a physical group of people that were on the earth at that time? Or do you think that they were just saying these promises are going to be fulfilled in the resurrection, by the Israel of old, those of faith in the Old Testament, because they're going to rise, we're going to sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So were they looking for just something to be fulfilled in the resurrection, or were they looking at Jews at that time and thinking they were going to be somehow brought back?
No, they did believe. Well, some believed in like a mass conversion of Jews at Christ's second coming, which doesn't necessarily mean that these same ones believed in like the land promises.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some that actually believed in some. I don't have names offhand, but I could go back and refer you to some of those names, including. But what's interesting, during the 1800s, there were actually more than a couple Reformed theologians, because when dispensationalism with John Darby and other, took off in the 19th century, the idea of the reformer, some of these Reformed theologians were introduced to, they had to respond to the idea that Israel was going to become a nation again. And I think one of them, maybe it was Burkhoff. Don't quote me on that. I, again, have to go back, and I have a number of statements on Reformed theologians, but there were some who kind of mocked the idea, kind of made fun of the idea that Israel would become a nation. It'd be like saying the Aztecs are going to come back and, conquer Mexico today. It's like, what are you talking about? And so, but they just said, well, look, this is what scripture says. Israel's going, and then what do we find in the late 19th century. We find a little trickling in, and then eventually, you have Balfour Declaration, and then Israel becoming a nation in 1948. And I actually think that's a fulfillment of the dry bones rattling together in Ezekiel's prophecy. But I don't think it's the flesh. I think the flesh is going to be put on the bones when they recognize that Jesus is their Messiah, and that's only going to happen when Jesus returns.
Okay. Yeah, I know that's a pretty common position. I think it was I don't know if it was Gill, was it John Gill, didn't he teach that in his commentary too? He believed in like a restoration of physical Israel.
Yes, I don't know the specifics of how he understood the land promises, but I think he did affirm. Spurgeon did as well. Again, on the specifics, I don't know, but at least they generally did not spiritualize. That's kind of the main point here. They didn't spiritualize these promises in the Old Testament. They knew that somehow an ethnic Israel, Jews, would be part of that fulfillment, rather than a supersessionist interpretation and redefining what Israel is now as the church, or it's all fulfilled in Christ and so forth.
Okay. Yeah, I have read a few of people before Zionism that taught that, and it's always interesting to kind of get their perspective on it. But one thing too I've been interested in, just from some older things that I've been reading too, is on the subject of whether or not there are two phases to Christ's coming. Because today, in our modern vernacular that we would use, there is a difference between the rapture and the second coming, and obviously the term rapture is in the Bible, but the coming of the Lord is, and clearly in some of the, rapture passages, it refers to it as the coming of the Lord. But when you go back and you read these older things, where they didn't use the term rapture, it definitely seemed like one event. So this concept that, I think most people, for sure in the pre-trib world, most people in the pre-wrath world, I think, affirm the idea of two phases to Christ's coming. Is that something that you find in history? And if you do find it in history, how did they distinguish it? I guess what would be the terminology they would have used?
Well, I would understand the parousia, second coming of Christ, as not just two phases, but maybe 30 phases. This is what I mean by that. So I'd like to make the analogy of Christ's first coming. We don't identify the first coming with Jesus's birth. It was more than just his birth, right? It was his arrival and his continuing presence. That's actually what the Greek term parousia means. It means an arrival and a presence. And so, in other words, so pre-wrath, I think what pre-tribulationism does, they make the error of disconnecting the rapture resurrection from the parousia, the second coming of Christ. And I think post-tribs make the opposite error, and they identify the rapture resurrection with the second coming of Christ. Pre-wrath instead sees it as belonging to the second coming. In other words, the second coming of Christ it's an extended event, just like the first coming of Christ. When Jesus returns, one of the first very divine events in the second coming will be the rapture, resurrection, and then you have the pouring out of God's wrath, the salvation of Israel, Jesus being set up as king at the seventh trumpet. You have the millennial. In fact, in the millennium, that's the apex of Christ's second coming. So in other words, I'd like to put it this way. The second coming of Christ is not some singular punctiliar event. It's an extended event when Jesus comes back as deliverer, judge, and king. All those are part of that second coming of Christ. And, let me also mention something like that some of your listeners might be interested in. You might appreciate, maybe you've mentioned this to your listeners, but the original 1611 Bible, King James Bible, in the margin note of Matthew 24, verse 31, pre-tribulationists say, no, that's not referring to the rapture. That's referring to the gathering of Israel, and just, has nothing, Matthew 24 doesn't have anything to do with the rapture or the church. It's interesting that the King James translators in the margin note next to Matthew 24:31 have two references, cross references. First Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 17, the rapture passage, and then they have the 1 Corinthians 15, is it 52, the resurrection passage. So they identify, the King James translators, they knew nothing of the idea of disconnecting the rapture from the second coming of Christ. And every commentator, even before before 1611, never identified or never disconnected the Paul's teaching of the rapture from the Jesus's teaching in Matthew 20:24.
Yeah, no, I have noticed it before. I don't bring that up enough because that is a great argument. I've got a replica 1611 King James Bible right there on my desk, and that is an interesting thing. And yeah, and that's the thing. I can't find any separation, any way to to make it like two different things in older writings. Again, I still, I don't see the rapture as the same thing as Christ coming at Armageddon. But historically, it seems like they made everything about it, or they made it all one event, to me. And so I do think that's really interesting. So, when it comes to historical things, are there any older views of end times things that you might find interesting that are uncommon today? Theories about the Antichrist, the Pope being the Antichrist. I've read some stuff that King James wrote that's very interesting because, he had obviously a different view in a lot of different areas. But how did you put that? Because I'm going to use that with Augustine, like a newspaper. How did you put that?
Well, he would be the first newspaper exegete.
Okay.
Reading scripture, and he looked at the current events and he read it back into scripture.
Yes, and that's a great way to put it because we still do that today, but they did that. It seems like they did that throughout the centuries. King James for sure did it in some of his writings. So, and I've read some theories that he had, and how he explained certain things that are kind of confusing. That's very interesting, intriguing. Some things I would say, yeah, he had it wrong. But some things like, he could be right on this. Are there any things that you have found historically that we don't really talk much about today that are even things that you might think are just completely off the wall?
Well, I think one note I want to make is, I've always challenged pre-tribulationists of giving me any imminent statement in the church, not just the early church, but anything up to the 1800s. And sometimes that they struggle to do that. They'll say, well, this again, it's kind of reading imminence into certain early church father statements, such as, well, he says we're waiting for the Lord, and that's supposed to imply imminence and so forth, and it doesn't. But that's a whole nother discussion. But a lot of times they'll cite John Calvin and John Calvin is noted of saying that Jesus could come today. But I remind these listeners that John Calvin was a historicist. In other words, he actually believed that the church was encountering the Antichrist at that time, the Pope or the whole Roman system. So that's actually consistent with pre-wrath, not pre-trib. So again, I mean, John Calvin wasn't pre-wrath, but the whole point here is that pre-wrath teaches that, yeah, the rapture will be imminent only when the church has gone through through the Antichrist persecution. We don't know the day or the hour, but those days would be cut short with the return of Jesus. Now, I mean, John Calvin believed the same thing, except of course he didn't believe in well, again, he believed that these events were actually transpired in his life, which is why he believed it was imminent. A very different idea of pre-tribulational imminence, because pre-tribulational imminence does not believe that. They believe that the church is going to be raptured before the Antichrist arrives.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing. I think that was probably one of the first things I heard with you several years ago, was some of your things against imminence. Because to me now, several years later, I think that's one of the most easy teachings to debunk. But that's a very difficult thing to let go of, because in the pre-tribulational mindset, I mean, they have that constant thinking that Jesus could come back today. And it sounds awful, when you hear somebody say, no. And I understand why they get so offended by that. But then, when you go and look at, all right, well, now you listen to how they use the scriptures to teach it. It's like, wow, that's awful. That's not even close to what that passage is teaching. And so, yeah, I appreciate some of what you've put out on that subject. I think that's good. But one question that I've been challenged with quite a bit in recent years, and I wasn't even aware this was an argument until recently, but it was on the dating of the book of Revelation. I always believe, had heard it was in the 90s, probably, but now it seems like preterism is becoming a bigger thing, and preterism is dependent on Revelation being written before 70 AD. I don't think if it is written before 70 AD, it disproves everything that we teach. But if it's written after 70 AD, I think it disproves everything they teach. But what are your thoughts on the dating of the book of Revelation? Do you believe it was written before or after 70 AD?
Oh, I think it was certainly written after. I think in the 90s. But you are correct, though, because the futurist interpretation doesn't depend on whether it was written before. I don't have a problem if it was written before AD 70. I don't have a problem at all. That's important for preterists. You're right. Because if it was written before AD 70, it's still prophecy. Of course, they need it before 1970 or 1970 before AD 70. They need that because if it was after AD 70, then you don't have it doesn't become a book of prophecy for them, because they believe many of these events were transpired around AD 70.
Right. What do you think are some of the best ways, I guess, to disprove, that it was written before 70 AD?
I think some of the events when you're taking resurrection passages, for example, because when in Revelation 7, there's resurrection language here. Because if I think at least full preterists are consistent. They'll say that, look, the resurrection happened in AD 70. The partial preterists, of course, will not go that far. So I would go to the passages and say, well, in Revelation 7, talking about the resurrection and saying, look, this has not been fulfilled. You're actually going to argue. In other words, you have to be consistent. I mean, I would also go to some of God's judgment. I mean, specific judgments, like in the one of the trumpet judgments says that 1/3 of humanity died. Mm-hmm. Now they'll try to say that 1/3 of humanity in Jerusalem or Israel died, and actually that's not even true historically. So they have to kind of stretch and try to reinterpret some of these judgments then and get away from, I think, just the plain reading of some of these judgments that are very specific when it talks about the 1/3 of the earth being destroyed, or 1/3 of the rivers, or the seas. What do you do with that? The Dead Sea, the Dead Sea wasn't destroyed, or Galilee, or what do you do with some of this language here? So they have to really either, I think what they often do is spiritualize many of these prophecies to say that it's been fulfilled. So
yeah, well, and tell me your thoughts on this, because one of the ways I try to explain things to preterists is that it does seem like in the futurist world, most people completely ignore the events of 70 AD, and it does seem like there's a lot of coincidences. It was like the Jewish-Roman War lasted about 7 years. I do think that for sure there is a connection to the Olivet Discourse and the events of 70 AD, but the way I explain it is that I personally think that judgment that God brought on Jerusalem during that time was another example of God, kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah was an example to those afterwards that should live ungodly. And I personally think that that judgment that came on them was a witness to the world, because they were being judged for how they had handled the gospel. And one of these days, God's going to judge the whole world. And so I think that was kind of that was like a sample event. And so you can take the events of 70 AD and make application, in a lot of the prophecies, but the interpretation of the prophecies are still in the future, and we shouldn't take that event and make that the fulfillment. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it does, and it's very difficult because a lot of preterists, they focus on Matthew 24, but unfortunately, you have an arbitrary chapter break there. It's like I think they have a very difficult time to explain Matthew chapter 25 with God, Jesus, setting up with the goat's judgment, setting up the kingdom, and so forth on earth. This is not a heavenly scene. This is on earth. They have a difficult time with that. I want to mention one point is that when Jesus, because this one point is problematic both at the same time for preterists and pre-tribulationists. Because, as you know, pre-tribulationists say that Matthew 24 is not for the church and so forth. Well, Jesus is actually in Matthew 24, he's actually citing from the most explicit resurrection passage in the Old Testament. I mean, really, you have only several resurrection passages in the Old Testament. Isaiah 26, you have Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Jesus is actually citing from this resurrection passage in the context of him discussing the Great Tribulation and the gathering of the elect. And so, first of all, preterists, this is a point that I've challenged Jeff Durbin on, and he's never responded to this point. What do you do with, because Jeff Durbin is a partial preterist. He believes the resurrection is in the future, but he's linking the resurrection event in Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, with the gathering of the elect in Matthew 24. That's problematic for preterists, and they virtually ignore this point in their commentaries, in their speaking, and it's very clear. This is not just an illusion here. He's not quoting the actual resurrection event, but he's actually quoting where it talks about that it's going to be an unequaled persecution from the beginning of time, and then you have the Great Tribulation and the gathering and the resurrection. For pre-tribulationists, is problematic because you have the gathering of the elect, and the gathering of the elect there, once again, is who is being gathered. It's the elect, and Jesus again is linking that to Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now, of course, traditional pre-tribulationists say, "Oh, that's the Old Testament resurrection of Old Testament saints." That's so again, it's okay. That's begging the question there. There's no evidence of having two different types of resurrection there, and that's a whole nother point of debate.
No, that's a fantastic point, because yeah, you're right. Jesus definitely is connecting, by some of the words he said, what he's describing in Matthew 24 to Daniel chapter 12. And a lot of pre-tribbers they'll bring up the fact, well, where do we see the dead rising in Matthew 24? And they'll say things that are different are not the same, and therefore, that's not about the resurrection. But no, there's definitely, Jesus does make a clear connection to Daniel chapter 12 for sure. And I find it interesting too, and I pay very close attention to this whenever I listen to anybody on eschatology, but I don't know if I've heard you say the word rapture so much yet, but I keep hearing you say the word resurrection. And I'm always telling people on our side, I think the more biblical we make our terminology, the easier it is for us to win arguments, because you rarely hear pre-tribbers refer to it as the resurrection. And I think the reason for that is because it does create problems when you go to like Daniel 12, for sure, because they want to make everything, well, that's specifically about Israel, but it's like, no, the resurrection, this is a key event. This is an important event. And so I terminology shows what is forming someone's thinking. And when I hear him saying, rapture and, distinguish between rapture, second coming, use a lot of these different things, I find that concerning, no,
you're right. And so Jesus is he's connecting that Daniel 12 passage. Interestingly, Paul on the other end links his resurrection / rapture passage to drawing. He actually is drawing from the Olivet Discourse tradition. And it's interesting because if Matthew 24 had nothing to do with the church, or this is not quote unquote church teaching, right? Then why is Paul drawing 30 parallels from Matthew 24-25 for his own church situation? I'd like an answer for that from pre-tribulationists. Of course, they have their answers, but it's problematic. Why is Paul drawing so much from this quote unquote non-Christian, only for the Jews type of passage? I mean, Matthew 24, originally, it was intended for Jews, believing Jews. The disciples are the audience. The audience, so the audience of Jesus' teaching were the foundation of the church. They were the disciples. Are they not the church? Of course they're the church. They're the foundation of the church. And so Jesus is giving them church teaching in Matthew 24 and 25.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we forget too is all of Israel was supposed to follow Jesus. He was the Messiah of Israel. And one question I like to bring up all the time too is, at what point did the disciples quit being Jews? Because even in the book of Acts, we see them still hanging around the temple. We see them continuing to practice certain things. And so it's like, even though he's preaching to the Jews or disciples, this is what they're supposed to follow. This is what, this is for them. And, when Gentiles started getting saved, we were grafted into the very thing that Jesus started with Jews, with his disciples and things like that. And so again, the gathering of the elect, you brought up how the preterists avoid that too. I think that's another good point. I like that you brought up the comparisons too with Paul's, his connection to the Olivet Discourse, because Paul too, if you look at the words he uses the same words, the same language, and he uses the same timeline as Jesus. And he uses the term gathering, which is a word Jesus used in the Olivet Discourse, coming of the Lord, a word, a phrase Jesus used in the Olivet Discourse. And so I think it's a distraction when people just want to keep using these extra biblical words. And I'm not against extra biblical words, but why can't these people, use the words that Paul used, that Jesus used when describing their positions?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. One objection to saying that, one defense of pre-tribulationism, they say, well, Paul never talks about the tribulation before the rapture or the resurrection in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And I say, actually, he does. The term, he talks about, those who remain up to the parousia, those who are remain or alive and remain. That's actually one word in the Greek, and it's a term. It's actually only used 2 times. Paul doesn't just use some general, very common term of being alive, and it's only used 2 times in the New Testament, in verse 15 and 17. And the term refers to survival. It actually means survival. That's why a lot of translations say, alive and remain. I forget what the King James uses. But the idea here is that there's persecution. And when you investigate the term in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's not just survival, but it's survival where other people have already died. So it's interesting. Paul, once again, is drawing from this idea from the Olivet Discourse, because Jesus talks about this very same idea that those who they're going to be surviving, if those days are not cut short, no elect would survive. So Paul is using the exact same idea here, drawn from Jesus. So Paul, while he doesn't use the term Great Tribulation, he uses a synonym for the Great Tribulation in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, those who were survivors. So it undermines the whole idea of the traditional pre-trib view that, oh, people are going to just go on, believers are going to be going on with their everyday business, and a lot of them, just walking, strolling through the park, and all of a sudden they're going to vanish. No, Paul, that's not what Paul is speaking of. They're going to be under persecution, surviving, which, by the way, is nothing new. Pre-wrath, and I want to make this point, pre-wrath it's not really teaching anything new in the sense of the churches, the early church, all we're teaching is that the last generation of the church is going to be persecuted severely before Jesus returns. That's all we're talking. I mean, we have more distinctives, but that's basically what we're talking, and we're nothing special than many generations of the church.
Right. Yeah. And so, do you find yourself often having to just explain to people when you say pre-wrath? Because now, and maybe you might be different on this. Maybe you can kind of help clarify. But a lot of people in my world, we refer to ourselves often as post-trib, and I think pre-wrath is a little better because post-trib people think post 7 years, right? Post-Armageddon, and so I feel like I'm constantly explaining. It's like, well, here's what you don't understand. I don't think tribulation means 7 years necessarily. So I guess the way I like to ask people this question, if you're looking at Larkin's chart, where he's got the seals, the trumpets, and the vials, where do you put the rapture in Larkin's chart?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's interesting you mentioned his chart, because my current book, Pre-Trib, there, you'll see.
Let me get it on full screen.
You'll see his chart.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Anyway, it shows how they disconnect the rapture from the second coming. So I had to use that. So I would say that pre-wrath says, okay, at the midpoint we know, and this is something we can agree with pre-tribulationists. Of course, I affirm a future 70th week of Daniel. The midpoint begins the abomination desolation. Jesus is very clear that at the midpoint, at the abomination desolation, a period called the Great Tribulation is going to begin. So that Great Tribulation, we believe, is the Antichrist persecution against believers, and he's also going to go after a Jewish remnant. And then he says, we don't know the day of the hour. It's not going to go full 3.5 years. The 70th week of Daniel is not cut short. What is cut short is the Great Tribulation, the persecution against God's people. Revelation 7 shows this great multitude who just appear, in heaven. John's like amazed. Who are these people? And he's told that they came out of the Great Tribulation. They're wearing white robes. They have hands. It's resurrection language. In Revelation 7, it's juxtaposed to another group of people on earth, 144,000 from every tribe. I believe that's they're being protected. So two groups of people are being protected at some point during the second half of the day, 70th week of Daniel. We don't know. Again, we don't know the day of the hour, but sometime during the second half, it's going to be cut short, and two groups of people are going to be delivered. The church is going to be delivered to heaven, and then 144,000 are going to be protected on earth. They're given the seal of the Father, and actually says that why they're being sealed. They're going to be protected from what? From the wrath of God. That's going to be once the seventh seal is opened. The trumpet judgments are unleashed upon the world. So that's a fulfillment of when Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, 9, that we're not appointed unto the wrath. Of course, the context here is the day of the Lord's wrath. We're not appointed to that. We're going to be raptured, resurrected. We're going to be in heaven. And then once those judgments are finished, toward the end of Revelation, talks about the bride coming down from heaven. So we're not going to remain in heaven. The New Jerusalem is going to be descend to the earth, and there's going to be this restoration. I believe that the new heavens, new earth occur at the beginning of the millennium, not at the end. And then at the seventh trumpet, it's blown. King Jesus will be proclaimed, and then there's like this grand finale of bowl judgments that's going to decimate the world. And it's interesting that the metaphor used there are the bowl judgments. I think maybe the King James has vials. Is the Greek term is phile, and it's an idea that there's a number of, I think it's like over maybe 25 Greek terms in the New Testament that refer to different types of dishes and vessels. And the vial is philae is this very shallow dish. And the idea, the imagery there, the original audience would have understood that it's going to be like when the contents are emptied, it's going to be swift, very swift kind of judgment. I like to, it will be kind of like a grand finale of wrath. In fact, the bowl judgments are called the finality of God's wrath, the last of God's wrath. And then we'll be ushered into the millennial period. But what is distinctive of the pre-wrath position is that we don't believe that the rapture is at the beginning of the 7-year period, at the midpoint, or at the very end. We believe that during the second half, we don't know the day or the hour. Jesus says those days are cut short. So it's going to be that great tribulation cut short, and then God's wrath, and then deliverance, and then God's wrath is going to be poured out after deliverance.
Yeah, well, that sounds like basically the same thing that we would teach here. So you believe we're out of here before the trumpets and the vials.
Correct.
And you also put Revelation 7 as the rapture, too.
Yes, I do, because it's very explicit. It says they came out of the Great Tribulation. They have resurrected bodies, and that corresponds directly with Matthew 24, where the Great Tribulation is cut short. So, and it says the elect are gathered. Well, we see where the elect are gathered in Revelation 7. They're gathered to heaven. They're before the throne of the Father. And Jesus says the same thing in John 14. He says, I go to prepare a place for you, and when he comes back, he's going to take us where he is going, before the Father. Another passage would be 2 Corinthians 4:14, where the initial event of the parousia, Jesus says that, or Paul teaches that we're going to be before the Father. So we're going to be presented before the Father, and then, and again, while the judgments are unleashed on earth, after that, we will descend after the bowl judgments. Interesting, Isaiah 26 makes reference to that as well, about hiding in the rooms, the inner rooms. And that term there is typically referred to the Father's presence, i.e. heaven. So I believe it's not being protected on earth, but it's going to be protected in heaven. And Isaiah 26, interestingly, is one of the few resurrection passages in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's Isaiah 26 too, where it talks about death being swallowed up in victory, which is referred to in 1 Corinthians 15. When this mortal shall put in immortality, then shall be brought to pass the thing is written, death is swallowed up in victory. So, yeah, and so obviously I don't want to keep you too long, but I guess just in closing, kind of a question I would like to end with. When it comes to end times, one of the things that kind of gets my side in trouble sometimes is, we don't claim to have answers for everything. There's a lot of stuff that, I think we should be allowed to disagree when it comes to this subject. And you alluded to that early on. In the pre-trib world, and especially in the independent fundamental Baptist pre-trib world, they're very dogmatic on everything. And one of the things that I have learned as I have, to me, discovered errors, in the pre-trib, found some truth over in the pre-wrath world, I think there's a lot of areas where there's still like a lot to be explored, a lot to be studied, a lot to be talked about. But, I think we're kind of hitting these brick walls. We're all just trying to defend our camp so much that we're just kind of locking ourselves into positions. And, I guess, what are some areas that you feel we need to have a lot more conversations on, and we need to be discussing more, studying more? Because I think the more I talk about this, the more I'm challenged and the more I'm helped.
Well, I think, in just a word of exhortation to maybe IFB pastors would be like, look, do you love your tradition more than your sheep? And I say that kindly, because very difficult times are coming on the church. And I'd like to say that we're not going to be having Bible prophecy conferences during the Great Tribulation. We're not going to have pastors saying, hey, I was wrong. Let's have a conference. Let's re-educate ourselves. We know that that's not going to be the case, because Jesus says in Matthew 24:25, remember, I have told you ahead of time. He doesn't just simply say, look, I have told you this ahead of time. That's an ominous warning, because when these things begin to happen, it's going to be a domino effect. It's going to be too late to get your spiritual house in order. And I'm afraid that many believers are that were taught all their life that, hey, you're going to be raptured out of here before the Antichrist arrives. And then when he actually does arrive, I think a lot of believers are going to be vulnerable to the Antichrist and his schemes. And they're going to have trepidation in their faith, rather than those who are taught, no, this is when the Antichrist arrives. Yep, this is what Scripture, this is what Jesus taught, this is what Paul taught. Okay, let's do what we're supposed to do. And that is two things during the Great Tribulation. Number one, we are to live holy, righteous lives. We do not apostatize the faith. Rather, we get emboldened in the faith. And that is what, even in the face of the mark of the beast, that's what's going to make us an overcomer. And then the second thing we're supposed to be doing in the Great Tribulation is edifying the people of God around us. But if one is having trepidation, even a pastor having trepidation of his faith, like what's going on here, he's going to be vulnerable in his own spiritual life. And number two is, it's very difficult to edify the people around you when you can't even edify your own soul.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, he said too that, he said these things too because he did not want them to be offended. And, I think it's a really bad idea to teach people that, for one, that tribulation is God's wrath. I think that's a huge mistake, because then if they start going through tribulation, they're going to be all confused. Right. What did I do wrong? What's happening here?
That is a great point, because I think they're going to become like the Thessalonians. In 2 Thessalonians, the whole purpose of 2 Thessalonians is that Paul learned that they were identifying their persecution with God's wrath. Mm-hmm. And so Paul had to correct their bad eschatology, saying, no, you're not going under persecution because, in the first chapter, he talks about that the resurrection hasn't happened and so forth. Mm-hmm. But he says that, no, two events have to happen before God's wrath. The apostasy has to happen, and the man of lawlessness has to arrive. So I'm afraid that many pre-tribulationists will commit the same Thessalonian error that Paul tried to correct, because you're right. They're going to think, wait a minute, I've been left behind. And this persecution, this is God's wrath. And rather than learning from Paul's teaching, or this very same errors, unfortunately, I think going to be repeated in the future.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I was just trying to look it up, and last week, a Baptist pastor, he did a tweet, and so I'm going to be going off of memory because I just went and looked, and he deleted it. And he should have deleted the tweet because it was a really bad tweet, but he was basically saying that if I believed in a post-trib rapture, I would become the biggest prepper that there is. And, and he was talking about all these things he would do to prep and protect his family from all these things. And it's just and my response is still up. I just said, I'm glad the apostles didn't share your attitude when Jesus told them about the personal tribulation they would go through. I'm glad they were focused on eternal rewards and not trying to save their life on this earth. I'm thankful they were willing to lose it for his sake. And then I quoted John 16:33, these things have I spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation. Be of good cheer. I'm going to overcome the world. And, I do. I think that's a terrible attitude. And I think historically, Christians have suffered great persecution, but they've not suffered God's wrath. And I think it's such a huge mistake to make it seem like persecution, martyrdom is God's wrath. That's not even close to what we see in the Bible. It's not what we saw in the beginning of the church. We saw them suffering. They were never under God's wrath. And so, I'm thankful for people that are out there, speaking, the truth on this subject and preparing people. And so,
yeah, and the fifth seal is, that can't be God's wrath, because that's an expression of martyred saints, blood-bought saints being persecuted and put to death. Well, if that's God's wrath, then God is a liar, because in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he says that we're exempted from the wrath of God. He's talking about believers. God's wrath, God is coming back not to punish his blood-bought believers. He's coming back to punish the wicked. So that's just one example why the seals cannot be identified as God's wrath. Only when the seventh seal is opened are the trumpet judgment. And I encourage pre-tribulationists, just read the seals and compare it to the trumpet judgments. They're completely different. The trumpet judgments they're all coming from God, where the seals, I believe the scroll represents what's called a certificate of debenture. In other words, it's like God is allowing mankind to accumulate the debt of their wickedness, and then of course, once that scroll is opened, he's coming back to punish them for their wickedness. So the seals are an expression of man's wickedness against just their heart, and also against Christians. It's definitely not God's wrath. So you can't equate the seals with the trumpet judgments in that sense.
Right. Well, the problem again goes back to using theological terminology and not the words of the scriptures. So, for example, you hear people talk about the seven seal judgments, and Jesus is breaking the seals, therefore he's judging the world. But wait a minute, it doesn't call him the seven seal judgments. It shows him breaking the seals, and he's showing John things that are going to come to pass. But at that fifth seal, one of the things that those martyrs say is, "How long dost thou not judge?" So at the fifth seal, those who are being martyred are wondering when he's going to judge. And my response is always like, if the preacher was right, then the Lord should have said at that moment, "What do you think I've been doing for the last four seals?" But no, those were not the judgment of God. That's just Jesus revealing things. He's showing John as he breaks each one of those seals. And yeah, so great stuff, and we could go on and on with these things. But do you have any final words? And you mentioned one of your books. Any books you want to pitch? How do people find out more about your ministry?
Sure. Maybe I'll just pitch two real quick. This is my main book on the pre-wrath view, and that's Antichrist Before the Day of the Lord: What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Return of Christ. And then my current view, or my current book, is I'm responding to the foundations of pre-tribulationism, and that is pre-trib examining the foundations of pre-tribulation rapture theology. And I address what I can identify as the two foundations of pre-tribulationism. One is the first half of the book critiques the idea that God doesn't work with the church in Israel at the same time. And the second half of the book critiques this idea that the rapture and the second coming are disconnected from each other.
Okay.
So people they could go to alankurschner.com, and I have all those resources there.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the program. This is very interesting. I know there's a lot more things we could discuss, and yeah, it's great to have conversations. Maybe one of these days we can maybe even talk about maybe some slight differences in things, because I like to be challenged, sharpened on these things. It sounds like too, we probably have some differing views when it comes to Israel's role in the end times and things like that. But either way, as an independent fundamental Baptist, you're supposed to hate everyone that disagrees with you, but I'm not like that, and I get.
Actually.
What's that?
That's refreshing.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm confident enough in my theology that I don't have to make everyone conform to everything that I say. And a lot of people people I fellowship, they don't know how to handle that. It's just like they don't know how to handle that. But it's like I think there's great value in challenging each other on these things. And if we just cancel everybody who's not exactly like us, we're not going to be able to do that. All I'm going to do is succeed in finding some underlings that'll echo everything that I say, and I'm never going to be challenged, and I'm going to end up locking myself into error. And I've learned from the pre-tribbers I don't want to do that, because I want to get to the truth. And on this program, just a little reminder in case people are new to it, while I am a very opinionated person, I have strong opinions, I don't think I have all the answers, but I am willing to find out what they are. I'm willing to have my own beliefs challenged, and I'm willing to listen to what other people have to say and learn. And so, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I appreciate your Berean spirit. It's very refreshing to hear that. So,
thank you very much. Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate everyone joining me today. Make sure I'll leave a link to Brother Kurschner's website, and you can go check that out if you want to look into any of his books. But appreciate everyone watching this. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff. So God bless you. We will see you all next time.